The amber glow of the Venetian chandeliers cast dancing shadows across the polished mahogany of Sir Reginald Ashworth's dining room, where the cream of London society had gathered on that fateful October evening in 1934. The occasion was ostensibly a celebration, the announcement of his daughter Margaret's engagement to the promising young diplomat James Whitfield. But those who knew Sir Reginald understood that his dinner parties were never merely social affairs. They were carefully orchestrated theatres where business was conducted, alliances forged, and reputations made or destroyed with the precision of a master chess player. The host himself presided over the gathering with his characteristic blend of charm and calculation. Sir Reginald was a man who had built his considerable fortune through a combination of shrewd investments, political connections, and an almost supernatural ability to discern the weaknesses of others. His steel-grey eyes missed nothing as they swept across his assembled guests, cataloguing every gesture, every fleeting expression, every subtle shift in posture that might reveal something useful. Among the dozen guests seated around his table were some of the most influential figures in London's financial and political circles. Lady Victoria Pemberton, the imperious widow whose late husband had left her controlling interest in 3 major shipping companies, sat rigidly upright, her diamond necklace catching the light like captured stars. Across from her, Colonel Edmund Hartwell, recently returned from India with both a distinguished military record and whispers of irregularities in his regiment's accounts, maintained the bearing of a man accustomed to command despite the nervous twitch that had developed in his left eye. Dr. Marcus Bellwether, the family physician whose discreet services had made him privy to the secrets of half the peerage, occupied his usual place at Sir Reginald's right hand. His kind face and gentle manner had made him a confidant to many, though those who looked closely might have noticed how his fingers trembled slightly as he reached for his wine-glass, a tremor that had nothing to do with age. The conversation flowed with the practiced ease of people accustomed to such gatherings, touching lightly on politics, the arts, and the latest scandals that rippled through their rarefied social circles. But beneath the polished surface, currents of tension ran deep. Sir Reginald had not built his empire by being generous with his knowledge or forgiving of his enemies, and several of those present had reason to fear what he might know about their private affairs. As the evening progressed and the wine flowed more freely, Sir Reginald seemed to grow more expansive, his voice carrying that particular tone of a man who held all the cards and was preparing to play them. During the fish course, he made several pointed remarks about the importance of loyalty in business relationships. While discussing the port trade, he mentioned how unfortunate it was when trusted partners were discovered to have been less than honest about their dealings. "It's remarkable," he said, his gaze settling momentarily on Colonel Hartwell before moving on, "how the most respected individuals can harbor the most extraordinary secrets. Take, for instance, certain irregularities in military procurement that have recently come to light. One wonders how such things remain hidden for so long." The colonel's face flushed, but he maintained his composure, though his grip on his knife tightened perceptibly. Lady Pemberton shifted uncomfortably in her chair, while Dr. Bellwether suddenly found his soup extremely fascinating. It was during the presentation of the roast that Sir Reginald made his most significant announcement. Rising from his chair with theatrical precision, he tapped his crystal glass with his knife, calling for attention. "My dear friends," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence, "while we are here to celebrate Margaret's happiness, I find myself compelled to share some rather interesting discoveries I've made recently. It seems that among our circle, indeed perhaps among those present this very evening, there are individuals whose public faces differ rather dramatically from their private realities." The silence that followed was profound and electric. Margaret Ashworth, radiant in her pale green silk gown, looked at her father with growing alarm. James Whitfield, her fiancé, half rose from his chair as if to intervene, but Sir Reginald waved him back down with an imperious gesture. No need for concern," Sir Reginald continued, his smile sharp as a blade. "I merely thought it appropriate on this evening of new beginnings to clear the air of certain misconceptions. After all, what is family without absolute honesty?" He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a leather portfolio, placing it deliberately on the table beside his plate. "I have here documentation that I believe several of you will find most illuminating. Evidence of financial irregularities, personal indiscretions, and various other matters that some have worked very hard to keep hidden." The effect was immediate and devastating. Lady Pemberton's face drained of color, while Colonel Hartwell's military bearing finally cracked, his shoulders sagging as if under an enormous weight. Dr. Bellwether's hands began to shake so violently that he had to set down his wineglass to prevent it from spilling. "Father," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible, "surely this can wait." "My dear child," Sir Reginald replied, his tone almost gentle, "justice rarely waits for convenient moments, and justice, I'm afraid, is long overdue for several of our guests." He opened the portfolio with deliberate slowness, extracting several documents that he laid out before him like a card player revealing a winning hand. "Shall we begin with the matter of the missing regimental funds, Colonel? Or perhaps Lady Pemberton would prefer to explain first how she's been systematically embezzling from her late husband's charitable foundation." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock and horror that spread throughout the room. But before anyone could respond, before the accusations could be denied or defended, Sir Reginald suddenly stopped speaking mid-sentence. His eyes widened with surprise, then confusion. His hand went to his throat, and he made a strange, choking sound. The portfolio slipped from his grasp, scattering its damning contents across the polished table. He swayed for a moment, his face contorting with pain and bewilderment, then collapsed backward into his chair with a heavy thud. The silence that followed was broken only by the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner and the soft hiss of the gas jets in the chandelier. For several heartbeats, no one moved, as if the entire gathering had been frozen by the sudden, shocking turn of events. Then Margaret screamed. The sound shattered the paralysis, and suddenly everyone was in motion. Dr. Bellwether leaped from his chair and rushed to Sir Reginald's side, his medical training overriding his personal distress. James Whitfield moved to comfort his fiancée, while the other guests rose from their seats in various states of shock and confusion. "Stand back," Dr. Bellwether commanded, his voice carrying the authority of his profession. His hands moved swiftly and surely as he examined the fallen man, checking for pulse, breathing, signs of life. After several tense minutes, he looked up, his face grave. "I'm afraid Sir Reginald is dead," he announced quietly. "It appears to be some form of poisoning, though I cannot determine the exact cause without a proper examination." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Murder. In Sir Reginald's own dining room, surrounded by his carefully chosen guests, each of whom had just been publicly threatened with exposure and ruin. As the shock of the announcement settled over the room, as Margaret wept and James attempted to maintain order, as Colonel Hartwell muttered prayers and Lady Pemberton sat frozen in her chair, one figure remained remarkably composed. Standing slightly apart from the others, near the tall windows that overlooked the garden, was Mrs. Eleanor Fitzgerald, Sir Reginald's recently hired secretary. She was a woman of perhaps 40 years, unremarkable in appearance, with a sort of quiet efficiency that made her nearly invisible in social gatherings. Throughout the evening she had remained largely silent, observing the proceedings with the detached interest of someone whose presence was professional rather than personal. But now, as chaos erupted around the dining table, as voices rose in panic and confusion, Mrs. Fitzgerald stood perfectly still, and on her lips, barely perceptible but unmistakably present, was the faintest suggestion of a smile. It was not a smile of shock or hysteria, nor the nervous reaction of someone overwhelmed by sudden tragedy. It was something far more unsettling, a smile of satisfaction, of a job well done, of plans successfully executed. It lasted only a moment before her expression returned to one of appropriate concern, but in that brief instant she had revealed something that would prove crucial to understanding the events of that terrible evening. The game, as the great detective who would soon arrive to investigate this crime might say, was indeed afoot. And somewhere in that room of shocked and frightened people, a murderer sat among them, confident that their carefully laid plans had succeeded perfectly. But they had not counted on being observed by someone with the particular skills necessary to notice such telling details. They had not anticipated that their moment of triumph would be their first mistake in what would prove to be a most intricate and deadly game of deception. The arrival of the Metropolitan Police brought swift order to the pandemonium that had erupted in Sir Reginald's dining room. Inspector Geoffrey Bradshaw, a methodical officer with 2 decades of experience in London's criminal investigations, surveyed the scene with the practiced eye of a man accustomed to sudden death, though rarely in such opulent surroundings. His weathered face betrayed no emotion as he observed the assembled guests, each now a potential suspect in what was clearly a case of deliberate murder. The guests were immediately separated and questioned individually in Sir Reginald's oak-panelled library, while the dining room was cordoned off as a crime scene. Dr. Bellwether, despite his obvious distress at occupying the dual roles of witness and medical examiner, provided his professional assessment with admirable composure. The symptoms he had observed, the sudden onset, the choking, the rapid collapse, were consistent with several types of rapid-acting poisons, though he emphasized that only a proper post-mortem examination could determine the exact substance used. Inspector Bradshaw's methodical interviews revealed the explosive nature of Sir Reginald's final moments. Each guest confirmed their host's threatening revelations about hidden secrets and damaging evidence, though all claimed ignorance about the specific contents of the leather portfolio that had scattered dramatically across the table during his collapse. The documents themselves proved to be a damning collection of financial records, private correspondence, and what appeared to be detailed investigative reports compiled by professional inquiry agents. Margaret Ashworth, still trembling from shock, provided the most coherent account of the evening's progression. She confirmed that her father had been behaving strangely for several weeks, spending long hours in his study and making cryptic references to settling old accounts. James Whitfield corroborated her testimony while expressing bewilderment at his future father-in-law's calculated cruelty in exposing his guests' secrets so publicly. The other suspects offered varying degrees of cooperation. Colonel Hartwell maintained his military bearing while acknowledging ongoing investigations into his regiment's finances, though he vehemently denied any wrongdoing. Lady Pemberton spoke with icy dignity about her charitable work, her aristocratic composure barely concealing her fury at the accusations. Dr. Bellwether appeared genuinely shaken, his hands trembling as he described his futile attempts to save his longtime patient and friend. Mrs. Eleanor Fitzgerald proved particularly intriguing during questioning. The secretary had been employed for only 3 months, having arrived with impeccable references from a prestigious placement agency. Her duties had been primarily administrative, though she admitted that Sir Reginald had recently engaged her in compiling information for what he termed a personal project of great importance. When pressed about this project's nature, she claimed limited knowledge, insisting she had merely typed correspondence and filed documents without reading their contents. A crucial development emerged when Clara, a young parlour maid, came forward with trembling testimony. She had briefly entered the dining room just before the tragedy to retrieve a dropped napkin and had observed Sir Reginald taking a deliberate sip from his water glass immediately before beginning his fatal speech. Her account sent ripples of significance through the investigation. If the poison had been administered through the water, who could have accessed it undetected? The physical evidence presented several perplexing aspects. The poison had acted with remarkable speed and precision, yet preliminary examination of the food and beverages revealed no obvious signs of tampering. Wine glasses, plates, and serving dishes were collected for detailed analysis, but initial inspection proved frustratingly inconclusive. The kitchen staff, questioned extensively about meal preparation and service, provided consistent accounts with solid alibis. Most significantly, Margaret revealed that her father had spent considerable time that afternoon personally rearranging the seating cards, claiming he wanted precisely the right people in exactly the right positions for what was to come. This suggested a level of premeditation that made the successful poisoning all the more puzzling. Surely a man planning such revelations would have taken precautions against retaliation. As midnight approached and the initial shock crystallized into palpable tension, Inspector Bradshaw found himself confronting a classic locked-room mystery with multiple suspects, each possessing compelling motives for murder. The colonel faced disgrace and imprisonment. Lady Pemberton's reputations and fortune hung in the balance. Dr. Bellwether's professional standing was threatened by unknown secrets. Even the engaged couple had reasons for concern about scandal's impact on their futures. The psychological complexity of the crime, the sophisticated method of murder, and the intricate web of motives all pointed beyond his considerable but conventional abilities. Inspector Bradshaw reluctantly concluded that this case required more specialized expertise than standard police procedures could provide. Returning to his office, he placed a telephone call to a small flat in Whitehaven Mansions, where a certain Belgian gentleman of extraordinary reputation was known to reside. The case of Sir Reginald Ashworth's murder was about to encounter the methodical brilliance of Hercule Poirot's little grey cells. The insistent ringing of the telephone shattered the pristine morning tranquility of Hercule Poirot's Whitehaven Mansions flat. He regarded the instrument with a slight frown, his fastidious nature preferring the measured pace of a new day to remain undisturbed by such abrupt intrusions. At his precisely arranged breakfast table, 2 boiled eggs sat in their custom-made holders, identical in size and perfectly cooked, awaiting his attention. With a barely audible sigh, he rose and lifted the receiver. "Poirot here." Inspector Bradshaw's voice carried both urgency and familiar, grudging respect as he outlined the Ashworth case. A prominent financier murdered in his own dining room, surrounded by guests who each possessed compelling motives for his destruction. Poirot listened with characteristic attention, his head tilted slightly, absorbing not merely the words but the subtle hesitations and emphasis in the inspector's tone. When Bradshaw admitted the case had outstripped conventional police methods, requiring psychological insight rather than mere physical evidence, Poirot's interest transformed from lukewarm curiosity to genuine fascination. An hour later, Poirot stepped from the police car before the imposing Georgian facade of Ashworth House in Belgravia. His patent leather shoes clicked rhythmically against the cobblestones as he approached, his egg-shaped head tilting to observe the subtle signs of disturbance that lingered around the property like an invisible shroud. The well-tended gardens, the discreetly drawn curtains, and the constable stationed at the front door all registered in his methodical assessment. Inspector Bradshaw met him in the marble-floored foyer, looking considerably more ruffled than he had sounded over the telephone. As they walked toward the dining room, he provided crucial updates from the night's investigation. The post-mortem had confirmed strychnine poisoning, administered in sufficient quantity to cause death within minutes. The toxin had been consumed rather than injected, reinforcing the theory that poison had been introduced into something Sir Reginald had eaten or drunk during dinner. When they entered the dining room, Poirot stood motionless for several minutes, his green eyes bright with interest as they traveled methodically around the space. The scene told a story of interrupted elegance, crystal glasses abandoned mid-toast, plates bearing remnants of the final course, the leather portfolio lying open where its damning contents had scattered during Sir Reginald's collapse. With swift, precise movements, Poirot straightened a knife that pointed askew and nudged a candlestick to exact centrality. Only these small adjustments to restore order seemed to soothe his visible discomfort with the chaos. His examination was characteristically thorough. Using his pocket magnifying glass, he scrutinized the area around Sir Reginald's place setting, noting the ghostly ring of condensation near the host's plate that appeared slightly offset from its coaster. He studied the arrangement of chairs with particular interest, observing how Sir Reginald had personally rearranged the seating cards that afternoon to place precisely the right people in exactly the right positions. The servants provided invaluable insights into the household's dynamics. Mrs. Henderson, the cook of 30 years' service, confirmed that Sir Reginald had been unusually particular about the evening's menu, personally approving every dish weeks in advance. Collins, the butler, described the precise service timing with admirable detail, noting that he had poured water from the shared carafe at the sideboard, refilling glasses after the roast was served. Young Clara, the parlour maid whose testimony about the water glass had proved significant, trembled as she recounted her observations to Poirot. His gentle questioning revealed that Sir Reginald had seemed unusually animated during the meal, almost excited about something, consuming very little food despite his apparent good humour. Most intriguingly, she remembered seeing someone smile during the chaos following Sir Reginald's collapse. Not a smile of shock or hysteria, but something more unsettling. Mrs. Eleanor Fitzgerald agreed to a second interview with notable composure. Poirot observed her carefully as she repeated her account with mechanical precision, noting her remarkably detailed memory and the faint ink smudge on her left thumb. When questioned about her employment history, she provided dates and references with practiced accuracy, though something in her demeanor suggested layers of complexity beneath her professional exterior. The physical evidence remained frustratingly inconclusive. Fingerprint analysis revealed only expected impressions, and no foreign substances had been detected on any surfaces. The poisoned source remained mysteriously elusive, despite thorough chemical analysis of all food and beverages. As the morning progressed, Poirot's methodical investigation began revealing the intricate psychological landscape surrounding the victim. Sir Reginald Ashworth emerged as a man who had wielded information like a weapon, accumulating secrets to maintain power over others. His final dinner party had been designed as theatrical revelation, but someone had transformed his moment of triumph into their opportunity for revenge. The game, Poirot reflected with satisfaction, had indeed begun. His little grey cells were already stirring, sifting through the evidence, seeking the hidden patterns and subtle dissonances that would ultimately lead him to the truth behind the guest who had smiled during murder. The morning light filtered through the heavy curtains of Sir Reginald's study as Hercule Poirot prepared for his systematic examination of the dinner guests. He had requested that each remain available for individual consultation, and Inspector Bradshaw had grudgingly agreed to this unorthodox approach. Poirot arranged himself behind the mahogany desk with characteristic precision, his notebook positioned at the exact angle that pleased his sense of order, his fountain pen aligned parallel to its edge. "The psychology, mon ami," he murmured to Inspector Bradshaw. "It is everything in a case such as this. The physical evidence, it tells us how, but only the human heart reveals why, and more importantly, who." Colonel Edmund Hartwell entered first, his military bearing intact despite a sleepless night. Poirot observed how the man's eyes automatically surveyed the room's tactical positions before settling into the offered chair. The habits of command remained strong, though stress had deepened the lines around his weathered face and intensified that telltale nervous tick beneath his left eye. "Colonel," Poirot began with courteous deference, "you have served your country with distinction for many years, n'est-ce pas? Such service requires courage, honor, and absolute integrity." The words carried no accusation, yet Hartwell stiffened as if receiving a direct challenge. "I have always endeavored to serve with honor." the colonel replied carefully, his hands clasping and unclasping in his lap, a gesture that contradicted his controlled voice. "Mais certainement. Yet Sir Reginald spoke last evening of irregularities in military procurement. Perhaps you could enlighten me about these bureaucratic matters?" The military composure cracked visibly. Hartwell's jaw tightened and his gaze shifted toward the window rather than meeting Poirot's penetrating stare. "There have been questions raised about certain supply contracts during my final posting in India. Nothing proven, you understand? Merely administrative incompetence creating unfortunate appearances." Poirot nodded sympathetically while making precise notes. The colonel's explanation had the rehearsed quality of a man who had repeated it many times, yet his eyes betrayed deeper anxiety. And Sir Reginald, he had obtained evidence of these administrative mistakes. Ashworth was a collector of secrets, Hartwell said bitterly. He made it his business to know things about people, particularly things they preferred to keep private, whether his information was accurate or merely malicious gossip. He left the sentence unfinished, but his meaning was clear. Lady Victoria Pemberton swept in next, her black silk morning dress impeccable despite the previous night's trauma. She arranged herself in the chair with regal bearing, yet Poirot's trained eye caught the slight tremor in her gloved hands as she clutched her handbag. "Lady Pemberton," Poirot said with courtly deference, "you have dedicated much of your life to charitable works since your husband's passing. The Pemberton Foundation has helped countless unfortunate souls, has it not?" Her aristocratic mask slipped slightly. "My charitable activities are a matter of public record. I fail to see their relevance to this dreadful business." But Sir Reginald suggested certain irregularities in the Foundation's finances. Money intended for the poor perhaps finding its way to other purposes. Poirot's voice remained gentle, but his green eyes were penetrating. The composure crumbled entirely. "That man was a monster," she whispered fiercely. "He delighted in destroying people, in exposing their private struggles for his own amusement. Yes, I've had to make difficult decisions about the Foundation's resources. My late husband left certain debts, certain obligations that required creative solutions. But I have harmed no one and owe explanations to no one." Dr. Marcus Bellwether presented the most complex psychological puzzle. His genuine grief at losing a longtime patient was evident, yet beneath his professional demeanor lurked secrets that had driven him to visible desperation. Poirot noted the physician's trembling hands, the dark circles beneath his eyes, and how he started at every unexpected sound. "Doctor, you have served this family faithfully for many years," Poirot observed. "Such service creates bonds of trust, of confidence, yet Sir Reginald possessed information about you personally, something unrelated to your professional duties?" Bellwether's composure crumbled completely. "He knew about my gambling," he whispered, "about the debts, the money I borrowed from patient accounts to cover losses. I always intended to repay it, always planned to make things right, but the losses kept mounting, and the creditors became insistent." After the interviews concluded, Poirot requested a quiet reconstruction in the dining room. With Collins and Clara's assistance, he restored the table setting exactly as it had been the previous evening. His attention focused particularly on the area around Sir Reginald's place, where a faint ring of moisture on the polished wood told its own story. "Regardez," he murmured to Inspector Bradshaw, pointing to the displaced mark. The glass, it was moved, not by the man of order who prized symmetry, but by another hand, and the bitterness of strychnine. One does not drink such poison unknowingly unless the timing is perfect, the attention elsewhere. In the corridor afterward, Poirot encountered Mrs. Eleanor Fitzgerald carrying correspondence. She paused with almost invisible courtesy, her practical grey eyes meeting his without flinching. He observed the precise half-moons of ink beneath her nails, the severe efficiency of her appearance. "Madame," he said quietly. There was a moment when everyone looked at death. Not all faces looked alike. Tell me of yours." Her expression didn't change. "I prefer to be efficient, Monsieur Poirot." As afternoon shadows lengthened, Poirot stood once more before the restored dining table, his little grey cells working methodically through the psychological portraits that had emerged. Each suspect possessed compelling motives: financial ruin, professional disgrace, social destruction. Yet the method of murder suggested not passionate desperation, but cold calculation, precise timing, and intimate knowledge of both the victim's habits and the evening's choreography. The murderer had counted on theatrical chaos to mask their crime, but they had not anticipated Hercule Poirot's methodical attention to the small details that revealed the human heart's darkest secrets. The afternoon brought a subtle shift in the investigation's tenor as Poirot continued his methodical examination of the suspects. Margaret Ashworth entered the study with the fragile composure of someone who had spent a sleepless night confronting the reality that her father's enemies had been seated at their own dinner table. Her pale hands trembled slightly as she arranged herself in the chair, but her voice remained steady. "Your father was a man who prized control above all else," Poirot observed gently. "The seating arrangements, the timing of his revelations, everything was orchestrated with theatrical precision." Margaret nodded slowly. "He spent hours that afternoon rearranging the place cards. He said he wanted precisely the right people in exactly the right positions for what was to come. I begged him not to go through with it, but he insisted it would be a catharsis of sorts, as if destroying people publicly could somehow free them. And the portfolio, you had seen it before?" "It appeared about a fortnight ago. He kept it beside him constantly, like a talisman. When I asked about it, he said it contained truths that would protect me, though it never felt like protection." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "When he collapsed, the papers scattered everywhere. James gathered some, but Mrs. Fitzgerald collected most of them with remarkable efficiency for someone supposedly in shock." Poirot's green eyes sharpened with interest. "You noticed this particularly?" "One notices her," Margaret replied with quiet significance. "One must, if one is to understand how Father's house has changed since she arrived 3 months ago." James Whitfield followed, his diplomatic training evident in his careful composure despite the strain of the previous evening. When Poirot inquired about Sir Reginald's threatened revelations, the young man's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "A foolish letter from my Paris days, nothing criminal, merely indiscreet. Had it been made public, it might have cost me a posting, but hardly my life." His voice carried controlled anger. "What I minded was that exposing it would have caused Margaret to suffer for my youthful mistakes. Yet you remained in your seat throughout the evening. Lady Pemberton will confirm it. I was too occupied trying to prevent a public execution to move about the room." After dismissing Whitfield, Poirot summoned Collins for additional details about the evening's service. The butler's account revealed a crucial detail that had been mentioned, but not fully explored: Sir Reginald's personal water decanter, a cut-glass vessel he kept at his place setting and from which he poured his own specially filtered water. "He was most particular about it," Collins explained. "Said the temperature and mineral content had to be precisely right. No one else ever touched that decanter during service." Inspector Bradshaw, who had been growing increasingly frustrated with the lack of physical evidence, seized upon this detail. "If the poison was in his personal decanter, then we're looking at someone with intimate access to his private arrangements. That narrows our field considerably." "Perhaps," Poirot murmured, though his tone suggested reservations. "But consider the timing, mon ami. The poison acted with perfect precision. Not during the soup course, not during the roast, but at the exact moment of his greatest theatrical triumph. Such timing suggests not merely access, but intimate knowledge of his habits and psychology." A search of the house had meanwhile revealed additional evidence that seemed to point toward Colonel Hartwell. In his room, Inspector Bradshaw discovered correspondence with moneylenders, threatening letters from creditors, and most significantly, an empty vial that had once contained a commercial rat poison preparation, the same type that could yield strychnine when properly processed. The colonel had motive, means, and opportunity, Bradshaw declared with growing confidence. His military background would have given him knowledge of poisons, and his desperate financial situation provides clear motive. Yet Poirot remained troubled by the psychological profile. A career military officer, trained in strategy and discipline, would such a man commit murder in so public a setting, surrounded by witnesses, with no escape plan? The method suggests not desperate improvisation, but careful calculation. Young Clara, summoned once more to provide her testimony, repeated her observation about the smile she had witnessed during the chaos following Sir Reginald's collapse. It wasn't shock or fear, she insisted. It was satisfaction, like something had gone exactly as planned. And Mrs. Fitzgerald glanced at the mantel clock right after, just a quick look as if checking the time. As evening shadows lengthened across the dining room, Poirot stood once more before the restored table setting, his methodical mind working through the psychological landscape of the crime. The murder had been designed as theatre within theatre, exploiting Sir Reginald's own dramatic revelations to mask the precise moment of poisoning. The killer understood their victim perfectly, he murmured to Inspector Bradshaw. They knew he would create chaos, would command every eye in the room, and in that moment of supreme distraction, they struck with surgical precision. The game was growing more complex with each revelation, but Poirot sensed that the crucial pieces were finally beginning to emerge from the shadows. The arrest came with the methodical efficiency that Inspector Bradshaw preferred, though it brought Hercule Poirot no satisfaction whatsoever. Colonel Edmund Hartwell received the news of his detention with the stoic dignity befitting a career military officer, his shoulders squared despite the devastating evidence arrayed against him. The incriminating vial, discovered in his personal effects, contained unmistakable traces of strychnine in precisely the concentration found in Sir Reginald's system. "The case appears conclusive," Inspector Bradshaw declared with evident relief, as he presented the chemical analysis. Hartwell possessed both motive and means. His desperate financial situation provided compelling reason to silence Sir Reginald before those damaging revelations could destroy his reputation entirely. His military background would have furnished the necessary knowledge of poisons and their extraction from commercial preparations. Yet Poirot remained curiously unmoved by this apparent resolution, his egg-shaped head tilted in contemplation as he examined the evidence with characteristic precision. "Tell me, mon ami," he said quietly, "what strikes you as most remarkable about this discovery?" "The thoroughness of our search, I should think. Nothing escapes proper police methodology." "Non," Poirot replied, his green eyes bright with intellectual curiosity. "What strikes me most profoundly is the convenience of it all. A career military officer, trained in strategy and discretion, leaves such damning evidence in his own quarters. A man facing public disgrace commits murder before a dozen witnesses when countless private opportunities surely existed." He straightened a picture frame that hung slightly askew, his fastidious nature demanding order even amid chaos. "It is, how do you say, too perfectly arranged, like a stage set where each prop has been positioned with theatrical precision." A more thorough investigation of the household's recent changes revealed details that cast the crime in an entirely different light. Collins, when pressed for specifics about Sir Reginald's routines, disclosed that new instructions had appeared 3 weeks earlier regarding the crystal decanter's storage. Previously secured in a locked pantry cabinet, it was now to remain accessible in the study each evening. "Most unusual, sir," the butler confirmed. "The instruction came as a typed note, which was not Sir Reginald's custom. He typically scrawled his directions like a spider with ink on its legs." "And who prepared his typed correspondence?" Poirot inquired, though he suspected the answer. "Mrs. Fitzgerald, sir. She managed all such administrative matters with remarkable efficiency." The secretary herself appeared with her characteristic quiet competence when summoned, carrying Sir Reginald's leather-bound appointment book. "I thought this might prove useful," she said, her practical grey eyes meeting Poirot's without flinching. Sir Reginald was meticulous about recording his professional consultations. Poirot accepted the volume with careful attention, noting how her fingers lingered momentarily on its cover. The entries revealed a pattern of meetings with private investigators and legal advisors, but most significantly, repeated appointments with someone identified only as E.F., beginning exactly 3 months earlier, coinciding precisely with Mrs. Fitzgerald's employment. These consultations, Poirot observed with deceptive casualness, they concerned what matters specifically: administrative details primarily, filing systems, correspondence management, the usual secretarial responsibilities. Her voice carried the practiced neutrality of someone accustomed to deflecting curiosity about confidential affairs. After her departure, Poirot discovered additional evidence that the obvious solution failed to address. Among Sir Reginald's scattered papers, he found documents marked with precise timing notations in violet ink: 30 minutes, 2 minutes, 1 minute. The sort of methodical preparations that suggested not desperate improvisation, but sophisticated planning. Dr. Bellwether's reluctant medical testimony revealed the crime's true complexity. The poison's effect was remarkably rapid, he confirmed. Such immediate action would require either unusual purity or some method of accelerating absorption. Sir Reginald's elevated emotional state during his speech would have enhanced his circulation, creating optimal conditions for the toxin's maximum efficiency. This revelation transformed Poirot's understanding entirely. The murderer had not simply administered poison and hoped for success. They had engineered the perfect physiological and psychological conditions for its most dramatic effect. This suggested intimate knowledge of both chemistry and human behavior, combined with access to Sir Reginald's private routines and the ability to modify them without detection. As Colonel Hartwell was led away in handcuffs, Poirot observed Mrs. Fitzgerald's reaction from across the foyer. Her expression remained appropriately solemn, but he caught that same fleeting moment of satisfaction that young Clara had described. A subtle curve of the lips that spoke not of shock or sympathy, but of plans successfully executed. The true murderer, Poirot reflected with growing certainty, remained free and confident that their carefully constructed deception had succeeded perfectly. But they had not anticipated that someone might notice the small inconsistencies, the precise timing, and most tellingly, the smile that had revealed their moment of triumph during another's death. The arrest of Colonel Hartwell brought no satisfaction to Hercule Poirot, whose fastidious mind recoiled from solutions that failed to achieve perfect psychological harmony. As Inspector Bradshaw celebrated the case's apparent resolution, Poirot found himself increasingly troubled by the discordant notes that jarred against the otherwise elegant composition of the crime. A career military officer, trained in strategy and discretion, committing murder before a dozen witnesses with no escape plan. The method suggested not desperate improvisation, but sophisticated calculation, qualities that seemed fundamentally at odds with the colonel's bluff, straightforward nature. Returning to his temporary quarters in the Ashworth house, Poirot arranged his thoughts with the same precision he applied to his personal effects. Upon his writing desk, he placed several items in careful alignment: his leather notebook, his fountain pen, and a collection of colored threads he used for complex cases. Each thread represented a different aspect of the mystery: black for Sir Reginald's death, crimson for the colonel's financial desperation, silver for Lady Pemberton's embezzlement, pale blue for Dr. Bellwether's gambling debts. At the edge of this arrangement lay a single white thread, almost invisible against the paper, representing Mrs. Eleanor Fitzgerald's impeccable efficiency. His little gray cells worked methodically through the psychological landscape of the crime. The murder had required intimate knowledge of Sir Reginald's habits, his love of theatrical revelation, his precise timing for maximum dramatic effect. More significantly, it had demanded the ability to predict and manipulate his victim's emotional state, creating the perfect physiological conditions for the poison's rapid action. This suggested not opportunistic violence, but long-term planning by someone who understood Sir Reginald's psychology with almost clinical precision. The following morning brought an opportunity to test his growing suspicions. Poirot requested that the remaining household members gather in the drawing room for what he termed a small clarification of certain details. As they assembled, he observed their reactions with characteristic attention, noting how Mrs. Fitzgerald positioned herself with clear sight lines to both the entrance and the mantel clock, a tactical awareness that seemed oddly professional for a domestic secretary. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began with courteous formality, "there are certain aspects of this tragedy that continue to perplex me greatly. The timing, in particular, strikes me as remarkably precise. Sir Reginald collapsed at the exact moment of his greatest theatrical triumph. Not during the soup course, not during the roast, but precisely when his emotional state would accelerate his circulation and maximize the poison's effectiveness." He paused, allowing his words to settle, watching faces with the intensity of a naturalist observing specimens. Mrs. Fitzgerald's expression remained appropriately attentive, but he detected the slightest tightening around her eyes, the involuntary reaction of someone maintaining careful control. "Such timing," he continued, "suggests someone with intimate knowledge of Sir Reginald's psychological patterns, someone who could predict not merely what he would do, but when and how he would do it. This requires more than casual observation. It demands the understanding that comes from careful, prolonged study." Dr. Bellwether shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Surely any of us who knew Reginald could have anticipated his love of dramatic revelations. But to anticipate so precisely. Poirot's green eyes glittered with intellectual curiosity. To know that he would consume water at that exact moment, despite its bitter taste, this suggests someone who understood not merely his habits, but his psychology under stress, how excitement would override his normally acute palate, how his need for theatrical effect would make him vulnerable to manipulation. Margaret Ashworth looked puzzled. But surely the Colonel had observed Father's habits during his visits here. "Indeed, mademoiselle. Yet consider the psychological profile. A military man facing disgrace might well contemplate violence, but would he choose such a public method? Would he leave incriminating evidence in his own quarters? Or does this suggest someone else, someone who understood that the Colonel's obvious guilt would provide perfect misdirection?" Mrs. Fitzgerald spoke for the first time, her voice carrying its usual quiet competence. "You seem to suggest an elaborate conspiracy, Monsieur Poirot. Surely the simplest explanation is usually correct. In most cases, yes. But this crime possesses an elegance that transcends simple solutions. The murderer understood their victim perfectly, exploited his vanity and his need for control, and used his own theatrical nature as the weapon of his destruction." Poirot straightened a slightly askew picture frame, his need for order asserting itself even in the midst of revelation. Such sophistication suggests not passionate desperation, but cold, methodical planning by someone with exceptional patience and skill. As the gathering dispersed, Poirot remained behind, ostensibly reviewing his notes, but actually observing Mrs. Fitzgerald as she efficiently collected teacups and straightened cushions. Her movements possessed a precision that reminded him oddly of his own fastidious habits, but where his need for order stemmed from aesthetic preference, hers seemed to serve a more practical purpose, the unconscious efficiency of someone accustomed to leaving no traces. That evening, alone in Sir Reginald's study, Poirot examined the leather portfolio that had scattered its damning contents during the victim's collapse. Among the papers, nearly overlooked, was a single sheet bearing timing notations in violet ink. 30 minutes, 15 minutes, 2 minutes. The handwriting was feminine, precise, and utterly methodical. Someone had been counting down to Sir Reginald's death with the accuracy of a choreographer timing a performance. The psychological game was indeed underway, but Poirot now understood that he was not its instigator. Someone else had been playing a far more sophisticated game for much longer, and they had counted on the obvious suspects to provide perfect camouflage for their true purpose. The white thread on his desk suddenly seemed less invisible and far more significant. Tomorrow would bring new revelations, but tonight, Poirot was content to know that his adversary was worthy of his methods. The true murderer possessed not merely cunning, but genuine psychological insight, qualities that made them dangerous, but also, ultimately, detectable by someone who understood the human heart's capacity for both patience and revenge. The morning brought Hercule Poirot a renewed sense of purpose as he arranged himself in Sir Reginald's study with characteristic precision. His fountain pen lay parallel to his leather notebook, both positioned at exact angles that satisfied his fastidious nature. The case had evolved beyond simple murder into something approaching psychological artistry, and his little grey cells were finally beginning to discern the elegant pattern beneath the apparent chaos. The evidence speaks. Mrs. Eleanor Fitzgerald appeared promptly when summoned, carrying Sir Reginald's household typewriter in its leather case along with a neat arrangement of ribbons and carbon sheets. Poirot observed her movements with the intensity of a naturalist studying a particularly fascinating specimen, noting how she positioned each item with almost military precision. "Madame," he said with deceptive casualness, "I find myself curious about Sir Reginald's recent administrative changes. The typed instructions regarding his personal decanter, for instance, they were prepared on this machine?" "Certainly, Monsieur Poirot. Sir Reginald preferred all household instructions to be clearly typed for the staff's convenience." Poirot examined the typewriter with methodical attention, noting how the E struck slightly high and the R appeared faint on the downstroke. When he compared these characteristics to the instruction note that had moved the decanter from its secure storage to an accessible location, the mechanical flaws matched perfectly. More significantly, he observed the persistent half-moon of violet ink beneath Mrs. Fitzgerald's left thumbnail, the same distinctive shade that appeared on the timing notations found among Sir Reginald's scattered papers. "Violet ink," he murmured appreciatively. "An unusual choice for administrative work. You favor it particularly." "It reproduces clearly on thin paper," she replied with practiced efficiency. "Clarity is essential in all professional communications." The second crime, the household's fragile calm, shattered that evening when young Clara, the parlor maid, was discovered on the back landing in the grip of violent convulsions. Her tea tray lay overturned, cocoa spreading in dark stains across the carpet, while her limbs jerked with the unmistakable symptoms of strychnine poisoning. Dr. Bellwether, despite his own distress, worked with professional competence to stabilize her condition, administering an emetic and supportive measures that likely saved her life. "A smaller dose than Sir Reginald received," the doctor confirmed grimly. "Intended to frighten rather than kill, though it could easily have proven fatal." Inspector Bradshaw's face darkened with understanding. "Hartwell's been in custody since yesterday. He couldn't have done this." "Precisely," Poirot replied with quiet satisfaction. "Our murderer has revealed themselves through their own fear. Someone realized that Clara had observed too much during that fatal dinner party, particularly the smile of satisfaction that betrayed their moment of triumph." The kitchen staff's testimony proved illuminating. The cocoa had been prepared safely in Mrs. Henderson's kitchen, with multiple servants consuming portions from the same pot without ill effect. The poison had been added to Clara's individual cup after preparation, requiring intimate knowledge of the household serving routines and access to the service areas during the crucial moments. The false identity revealed. Collins, the butler, provided a crucial detail that had been overlooked in the initial investigation. "Mrs. Fitzgerald offered to assist us the evening before the dinner party," he recalled. She spent several minutes in each guest's room, supposedly checking for misplaced correspondence that Sir Reginald might require. Most unusual, as we don't typically accept such assistance, but she was remarkably efficient. This revelation sent Poirot immediately to the telephone, placing an urgent inquiry to the placement agency that had supposedly provided Mrs. Fitzgerald's impeccable references. The response arrived by telegram within hours. Its contents devastating in their simplicity. No person named Eleanor Fitzgerald had ever been placed by their agency. The reference cited in her employment documents were forgeries, including one signature that had been reported as fraudulent in a separate criminal matter. E.F., Inspector Bradshaw said quietly as he read the telegram. The initials that appeared repeatedly in Sir Reginald's appointment book. Indeed, Poirot replied, his green eyes bright with intellectual satisfaction. Our secretary has been meeting with herself, as it were. A most efficient arrangement for someone conducting a long-term deception. The psychological portrait. As evening shadows lengthened across London, Poirot stood before his carefully arranged evidence, the white thread on his desk no longer seeming invisible but central to the entire composition. The woman calling herself Eleanor Fitzgerald possessed not merely cunning but genuine psychological insight. She had studied Sir Reginald's character with clinical precision, understanding his vanity, his love of theatrical control, and his need to dominate others through the exposure of their secrets. Her method had been elegant in its simplicity. She had positioned herself as the perfect secretary, efficient, invisible, trustworthy, while systematically gathering the information Sir Reginald believed he was collecting for his own purposes. The timing notations in violet ink revealed her true role. She had been orchestrating the entire evening, counting down the minutes to Sir Reginald's death with the precision of a choreographer timing a performance. The poison had been administered at the perfect psychological moment, when Sir Reginald's excitement and elevated emotional state would accelerate his circulation and maximize the toxin's effectiveness. She had understood that his theatrical nature would override his normally acute palate, that his need for dramatic effect would make him vulnerable to the bitter taste of strychnine disguised in his specially filtered water. Most tellingly, she had prepared the perfect scapegoat in Colonel Hartwell, planting evidence in his room during her helpful assistance the night before the dinner party. A desperate man facing financial ruin made an ideal suspect, his obvious guilt providing perfect misdirection from the true killer's sophisticated planning. The game continues. As Poirot prepared for what he sensed would be the final phase of this psychological chess match, he reflected on the extraordinary patience and skill his adversary had demonstrated. She had spent months establishing her false identity, gaining Sir Reginald's trust and positioning herself for the perfect crime. Her mistake had been that moment of satisfaction, that barely perceptible smile that had revealed her triumph during another's death. Tomorrow would bring the gathering that would expose her completely, but tonight Poirot was content to know that he finally understood the full scope of her deception. The guest who had smiled during murder was about to discover that her carefully constructed performance had been observed by someone uniquely qualified to appreciate and ultimately defeat her psychological artistry. The white thread had become the central strand around which the entire mystery revolved, and Hercule Poirot was ready to pull it free, unraveling the elegant web of deception that had nearly achieved perfect success. The morning brought Hercule Poirot a sense of approaching resolution, though he understood that his most dangerous opponent would not surrender without a final, desperate gambit. In Sir Reginald's study, he arranged his evidence with characteristic precision, each piece positioned to contribute to the psychological pressure he intended to apply. The typewriter sat prominently on the side table, its distinctive mechanical flaws now serving as silent witnesses to months of calculated deception. Inspector Bradshaw arrived with additional intelligence that transformed their understanding of the case entirely. Among Mrs. Fitzgerald's carefully maintained personal effects, a thorough search had revealed a collection of newspaper clippings spanning 5 years, each chronicling Sir Reginald's business dealings with meticulous attention to their human cost. Corporate mergers that had eliminated hundreds of jobs, hostile takeovers that had destroyed family businesses, financial manipulations that had enriched Sir Reginald while impoverishing others. Someone had been tracking his activities with the patience of a hunter studying prey. "She's been planning this for years," Bradshaw said grimly, spreading the clippings across the desk. "This wasn't opportunistic murder. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign of revenge." Poirot examined the articles with growing fascination, noting the violet ink annotations in the margins, the same distinctive shade that had appeared on the timing notations found among Sir Reginald's scattered papers. "Observe the dates, mon ami. The earliest clipping coincides with a factory closure in Manchester. 300 workers dismissed when Sir Reginald's consortium acquired the property for redevelopment. Someone connected to that tragedy has been waiting 5 years for the perfect moment to strike." The psychological portrait that emerged was of someone driven by profound personal loss, masquerading as professional competence. Mrs. Fitzgerald had not merely assumed a false identity. She had crafted an entirely new existence dedicated to infiltrating Sir Reginald's world and destroying him from within. Her performance as the perfect secretary had been flawless because it served her deeper purpose, gaining intimate access to his habits, his psychology, and his vulnerabilities. Clara's expanded testimony, provided from her hospital bed, revealed additional crucial details about the evening of the murder. The young maid recalled seeing Mrs. Fitzgerald in the service corridors shortly before the dinner party, carrying Sir Reginald's personal water decanter with the excuse of ensuring it contained properly filtered water. More significantly, Clara had observed her consulting a small pocket watch immediately after Sir Reginald's collapse, as if confirming that her precise timing had been achieved. "She knew exactly when he would drink," Clara whispered, still weak from her own poisoning. "Like she'd studied his habits for months, learning exactly when his excitement would make him thirsty, when he'd reach for that glass without thinking about the taste." Dr. Bellwether's medical analysis provided the scientific framework for understanding the killer's sophisticated method. The strychnine had been administered in a concentration calculated to prove fatal within minutes while remaining undetectable until the moment of consumption. The bitter taste had been masked by Sir Reginald's elevated emotional state and his habitual consumption of mineral-rich filtered water. Whoever did this understood both toxicology and human psychology, the doctor confirmed. They knew that his excitement during those dramatic revelations would accelerate his circulation, creating optimal conditions for rapid absorption. This was the work of someone with genuine scientific knowledge, not a desperate amateur. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Poirot implemented a carefully calculated psychological strategy. Word was allowed to circulate through the household that certain technical irregularities had weakened the case against Colonel Hartwell, that expert consultation had raised troubling questions about the evidence. The colonel, while not released, was moved to more comfortable quarters, and the staff were informed of an evening gathering where certain clarifications would restore order and dignity to the investigation. More significantly, Poirot arranged for it to be known that Clara would return that evening to share a crucial memory about the dinner party, something she had just remembered about the moments following Sir Reginald's collapse. "The murderer will not fear the police," he explained to Inspector Bradshaw, "but they will fear the witness who saw the smile of satisfaction that betrayed their moment of triumph." Mrs. Fitzgerald's reaction to these developments provided the final confirmation of her guilt. When summoned to type notices about the evening gathering, she arrived with her usual professional competence, but Poirot detected subtle signs of strain beneath her composed exterior. Her questions about the gathering's purpose were carefully casual, yet her eyes betrayed genuine concern about Clara's potential testimony. Most tellingly, a search of her quarters revealed a railway warrant to Dover dated for the midnight boat train, hidden within what appeared to be a routine letter of resignation. The document bore the name Eleanor Fitzgerald, but Poirot's examination revealed it had been purchased with cash and bore no official validation, the preparations of someone planning immediate flight from justice. "She has realized that her perfect crime is unraveling," Poirot observed with quiet satisfaction. The attempt on Clara's life was born of desperation, not calculation. For the first time in months of careful planning, she has acted impulsively, and that impulsiveness has revealed her true nature. As evening approached, Poirot prepared for what he sensed would be their final psychological confrontation. The woman calling herself Eleanor Fitzgerald possessed remarkable intelligence and patience, but she had made one crucial error. That moment of satisfaction during Sir Reginald's death had betrayed her true feelings. Now, faced with the prospect of Clara's testimony and the gradual accumulation of evidence against her, she was beginning to crack under the pressure of maintaining her elaborate deception. The game had evolved from simple detection into psychological warfare between two sophisticated minds, but Poirot was confident that his methodical approach would ultimately prevail. Tomorrow's gathering would force her hand completely, compelling her to choose between maintaining her false identity and attempting desperate flight. Either choice would provide the final evidence needed to ensure justice for Sir Reginald's murder and the attempted killing of an innocent young woman whose only crime had been observing too much. The white thread that had seemed so insignificant was about to prove itself the key that would unravel the entire web of deception, but only if Hercule Poirot could maintain his psychological advantage against an opponent who had already demonstrated her willingness to kill to protect her carefully constructed revenge. The drawing room of Ashworth House had been transformed into a theatre of justice, its elegant furnishings arranged with a mathematical precision that satisfied Hercule Poirot's fastidious nature. Each chair occupied its exact position from that fatal evening, the amber gaslight adjusted to illuminate faces while casting revealing shadows across the assembled company. Inspector Bradshaw stood near the door, his hand resting casually but meaningfully near his service revolver, while the suspects took their places with the reluctant dignity of players in a drama they had not chosen to join. Colonel Hartwell, recently released from custody but still bearing the weight of suspicion, maintained his military bearing beside Lady Pemberton's aristocratic rigidity. Dr. Bellwether appeared genuinely bewildered by the suggestion that the obvious solution might prove false, while Margaret and James sat together, their youth a stark contrast to the weary tension surrounding them. Mrs. Eleanor Fitzgerald entered last, carrying her leather portfolio with characteristic efficiency, positioning herself near the door with what appeared to be professional discretion but which Poirot recognized as tactical awareness. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began with courteous formality, his egg-shaped head tilted as he regarded each face with penetrating attention. "We gather to restore order to chaos, to illuminate the darkness of deception, and to ensure that justice, true justice, is achieved for Sir Reginald Ashworth's murder." He moved with deliberate precision to the mantelpiece, where evidence had been arranged in careful alignment. The typewriter with its distinctive mechanical flaws, newspaper clippings annotated in violet ink, timing notations that revealed months of patient planning, and forged employment references that had created Eleanor Fitzgerald's perfect facade. "This crime has been presented as desperate improvisation by a ruined man facing exposure," Poirot continued, his green eyes bright with intellectual satisfaction. "Yet my little grey cells have discovered a far more sophisticated truth, a masterpiece of psychological manipulation spanning 5 years of methodical preparation." The typewriter occupied a prominent position, its mechanical signature now serving as silent testimony to elaborate deception. Observe the distinctive E that strikes high, the faint R on the downstroke, characteristics that match every document used in this conspiracy. The household instructions that moved Sir Reginald's personal decanter from secure storage to accessible location, The correspondence that established false credentials, the timing notations that counted down to murder with choreographic precision. Mrs. Fitzgerald's expression remained appropriately attentive, but Poirot detected the slightest tightening around her eyes, the involuntary reaction of someone maintaining careful control under mounting pressure. The killer understood Sir Reginald's psychology with clinical precision. He pressed on relentlessly. They knew his love of theatrical revelation, his need to control others through exposed secrets, his vanity that would make him vulnerable to manipulation. Most significantly, they understood that excitement would accelerate his circulation, creating optimal conditions for rapid poison absorption. He straightened a picture frame that hung slightly askew, his need for order asserting itself even amid revelation. Such intimate knowledge required months of patient infiltration, systematic study of daily routines, careful preparation for the perfect moment of revenge. The killer positioned themselves as the ideal secretary, efficient, invisible, trustworthy, while orchestrating their victim's destruction. Moving to the collection of newspaper clippings, his fingers traced violet ink annotations that told their own story of patient observation and growing hatred. 5 years ago, Sir Reginald's consortium acquired a Manchester factory, dismissing 300 workers for property redevelopment. Among those workers was Elizabeth Forrester, whose father suffered fatal heart attack upon learning of his dismissal after 30 years of faithful service. The name struck like a physical blow. Mrs. Fitzgerald's composed facade showed its first significant crack, her hands beginning to tremble almost imperceptibly in her lap. Elizabeth Forrester disappeared after her father's funeral, but her grief and determination did not vanish. Instead, she transformed herself into Eleanor Fitzgerald, note the preserved initials, and began infiltrating Sir Reginald's world. The placement agency references were forged, employment history fabricated, entire identity constructed for singular purpose, positioning herself for perfect revenge. The psychological pressure built with each revelation. The murder itself demonstrated masterful timing and psychology. The killer knew exactly when Sir Reginald would reach for his water glass, when excitement would override his acute palate, when theatrical need would make him vulnerable to strychnine's bitter taste. Poison was administered at his moment of greatest triumph, transforming power into final defeat. Mrs. Fitzgerald stood abruptly, portfolio clutched against her chest like armor. Fascinating speculation, Monsieur Poirot. But surely you require actual evidence beyond psychological theories. Indeed I do, Mademoiselle Forrester, Poirot replied with quiet satisfaction, using her true name with deliberate emphasis. The violet ink beneath your thumbnail matches timing notations found among Sir Reginald's papers. Young Clara observed your smile of satisfaction during the murder's chaos. Involuntary expression of successfully executed plans. Most tellingly, the left-handed ink stains reveal how you changed typewriter ribbons, and the decanter's displaced watermark shows left-handed pouring when Sir Reginald was strictly right-handed in his placement habits. The mask finally shattered completely. Elizabeth Forrester's face transformed from professional composure to something approaching feral satisfaction as she realized her elaborate deception had been thoroughly exposed. "He destroyed my father," she whispered, voice carrying 5 years of suppressed rage. 30 years of faithful service, dismissed like unwanted furniture for profit margins. My father died believing he was worthless, that his life's work meant nothing. And so you devoted your life to revenge, Poirot observed, with something approaching sympathy. Tragedy compounded by tragedy, justice perverted into something darker. Inspector Bradshaw moved forward, but Elizabeth Forrester was already reaching into her portfolio, not for a weapon, but for a small vial identical to the one planted in Colonel Hartwell's quarters. "Perfect justice," she whispered, raising the vial toward her lips with the same methodical precision that had characterized her elaborate revenge. But Hercule Poirot had anticipated even this final gambit, his hand closing firmly over hers before poison could complete its deadly work. Justice, he reflected, must never become vengeance, no matter how perfectly orchestrated or psychologically justified.